Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chanel Hasty, a staffer here at IEDC. We want to welcome you all to today's webinar event, COVID-19 Metro Recovery, Watch a Framework for a Racially Inclusive Recovery. This event is part of IEDC's new Take Action Against Racism and Economic Development webinar series, a series developed in response to the race and justice movement currently enveloping the United States. Before we get started, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. Please note that all attendees will be muted during the webinar. You will have an opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing them into the questions pane in your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will address them during the Q&A session. Within 48 hours of today's webinar, a recording of the webinar and the presenters' slide decks will be sent to all attendees. Now, I would like to introduce you to our speakers for this webinar. Joseph Parilla is a fellow at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, where he oversees a research and strategy portfolio focused on the trends and policies that influence inclusive economic growth in cities across the U.S. and the world. He authors publications, delivers public presentations, and provides commentary to media on topics such as economic development, small business trends, and talent development. Most recently, Joseph has delivered real-time analysis and practical guidance on how local and regional leaders can mitigate economic damage from COVID-19 and drive an inclusive recovery. Andy Reed serves as a program manager at Prosper Portland. At Prosper Portland, Andy works across teams to design, build, and manage inclusive economic development programming to support micro-enterprise, small business, and traded sector businesses in Portland, Oregon. He also currently manages a portfolio of 60 public benefit agreements with companies receiving tax incentives through the city's Enterprise Zone program. Andrea Gall is a project manager for business development and international affairs at Prosper Portland, the city's economic development agency. She manages Portland Means Progress, an initiative that connects businesses to programming that supports social impact, creating a pipeline for private sector engagement and racial equity work. Andrea also manages the Mayor's Economic Recovery Task Force, formed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Kimberly Howard is the program manager for PGE Project Zero, a new social impact initiative at Portland General Electric, empowering the next generation to create cleaner, greener, more equitable communities. As part of the corporate social responsibility team, Kimberly also provides leadership, project management, and community engagement strategies for community education and workforce development. Kimberly also serves as the program officer for the PGE Foundation, the corporate foundation of Portland General Electric. Now, Joseph, over to you.
Chanel, thank you so much. And to Jeff and to Alexa and to the rest of your colleagues at IEDC, I'm just very grateful for the opportunity to brief this group. As I understand it, this has been one in a long line of really informative webinars. And so I think my objective today is to share a bit with you all on how Brookings is approaching this question of economic recovery. And 2 months ago, we launched a new suite of data and actionable ideas and local case studies that are all focused on this theme of economic recovery planning. And if you'll go to the next slide, you'll see that in a framing paper to launch that series, I, along with my co-authors Amy Liu and Alan Barugi, offered the following vision for recovery: that in the wake of this crisis, local and regional leaders will try to rebuild better. And by that, we mean generating higher quality jobs and wealth creation opportunities in their communities in the aftermath of COVID in ways that advance racial inclusion. If you go to the next slide, the context for creating more and better jobs is abundantly clear. This spring, in the span of weeks, a decade's worth of job growth was wiped out by the measures taken to safeguard the country against COVID. about half of those 20 million jobs have since come back, but we're still at about 2014 levels of employment. So a tremendous gap in jobs to be made up. The next slide provides the context for intentionality around racial equity, why this is also a clear objective. During the crisis, about 4 in 10 white households have been affected by the job losses that I showed on the previous slide. But 5 in 10 black households have reported this, and 6 in 10 Hispanic or Latino households have. So this disproportionate job loss is worrying, also because it's consistent with prior downturns, meaning that when the economy contracts, people of color tend to get hit hardest. Black workers in particular, for those that remain employed, are working disproportionately in frontline occupations, things like grocery stores and child care centers, healthcare facilities. So putting themselves at risk to maintain critical services and infrastructure, but also putting them much more likely to be exposed to the coronavirus. So on multiple levels, we have racial inequity in the current crisis. And so the next slide, we offer, with this context, we offer 3 principles for recovery strategies. So it strikes us that communities right now are undertaking, I think, in earnest, true recovery planning. I think up until this point, it's been emergency, triage, and then kind of mitigation. And now, as we try to proceed towards some sense of normalcy, a sense of recovery. And the first principle that we have is an acknowledgement that we need to be explicit about the dual mandate that I laid out earlier. Ultimately, we need actually metrics and goals to understand if things are working or not in the recovery period. And our sense is that broadly, we want to track 2 conditions. First, we want to see if growth in the wake of COVID is productive, if it's high value, meaning that businesses are producing more goods and services per worker employed, and with those productivity gains, average wages are going up, not just that the productivity gains are being done on the backs of workers. And second, growth in the wake of COVID is inclusive, meaning that more people are employed, poverty is going down, and importantly, racial disparities are closing as the economy recovers. The second principle, as you see, is an acknowledgement that executing a recovery strategy requires major capacity, coordination, and trust. And that last factor, trust, is perhaps most important because right now, the United States feels like a very low trust place, especially when it comes to traditional institutions, to which many Americans, especially younger people, assign responsibility and blame for current injustices. So the second principle around building new institutional capacity acknowledges that if cities and regions and states, and here we're talking about government plus the private sector plus philanthropy plus nonprofits, if those coalitions rely primarily or only on traditional institutions to carry out recovery planning and implementation, they run the risk of sacrificing credibility with a diverse new generation of stakeholders that are perhaps less connected to those traditional institutions. And so our sense is that local and regional leaders should use this moment to partner with, develop the capacity of existing institutions or establish new partnerships in ways that have credibility explicitly in Black and Brown communities that are on the losing end of the disparities that I showed in those earlier slides. And that these entities, the coalitions that are working on recovery, have to engage a lot of actors, a diverse set of actors in decision-making, and hopefully in the process, bring together longer-run multi-sector commitments that move towards these big goals around productivity and inclusion that I outlined in the first principle. We think that if you actually can demonstrate validity and trust across a lot of stakeholders, that economic development actors have a better shot at sustaining longer-run commitments to their work. With these broader coalitions, the third principle is one that tries to showcase that recovery strategies should be investing pretty broadly in the drivers of racially inclusive growth. The next slide outlines the three-part framework that we've been thinking about in this regard. First, we think that recovery strategies should incentivize and nurture the growth of higher quality businesses and industries. So this is very consistent, I think, with the objectives of economic development. And this means stabilizing and strengthening neighborhood small businesses. Not only that, but also working within kind of tech and growth startup ecosystems with an intentionality towards supporting communities of color attached to those wealth generating parts of the economy. They should be providing outreach and services to what we would call missing middle small businesses that generate quality jobs and have an opportunity to capture new production opportunities that boost their resiliency to future global risks, things like the manufacturing supply chain. So this is a very important principle, or first part of the framework in terms of the productive and inclusive growth dual mandate. Second, we think that recovery strategies should source and develop a racially diverse talent base. So our communities continue to diversify, our workforce continues to diversify, but we have unequal access to the labor market, depending on your neighborhood and at times because of your race. We think that needs to be intentional, while also new commitments to lift the quality floor across all jobs, because we just don't want to repeat the challenges that we had in the wake of the Great Recession, where we actually grew a lot of jobs, but they were not providing jobs that led to economic self-sufficiency or entry into the middle class. And so on the skills part of the framework, this requires very strong partnerships between workforce development, economic development, higher education, focus on pathways to better jobs. We think in the long run, that's the right work to be done. It's about the system, talent development system. In the near term, we still think that there is an opportunity to launch kind of particular efforts, what we call these service corps, that can deploy recently unemployed residents to meet short-term community needs and bolster long-term infrastructure needs. Third part of the framework is around supporting connected, vibrant, and inclusive communities. So this is where local leaders could establish what a colleague of ours calls digital equity offices that promote universal broadband access, could use a soft real estate market to launch affordable housing acquisition strategies, power what our colleagues call community real estate investment trusts, which are hyper-local intermediaries that help neighborhood residents attach to investments in their communities and actually benefit in terms of wealth generation when those investments pay off. All of this is aimed at attacking the place-based, long-standing place-based and race-based disparities in our cities when it comes to access to economic mobility. I'm going to conclude just by saying that we have all this online. We populated the framework that I just mentioned with 9 concrete ideas that I just went through in a very brief way. We've also profiled 10 local recovery case studies that we think are leading practice, and we're going to continue to build this out over the fall and winter. You can also track trends in your local labor market, real estate market, and other areas of economic activity using our Metro Recovery Index, which provides you standardized data on what's happening in real time. The objective of this website is to provide both data and solutions as you all undertake this incredibly difficult undertaking. And I have the pleasure of now turning it over to Andy Reid for the second part of our presentation, which is kind of like a living and breathing case study around what's happening in Portland, because we think it's a really interesting model that embeds racial equity into economic development. So, Andy?
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, IEDC, for your hosting this. This is really helpful. Again, my name is Andy Reid. I'll be presenting this next round of the conversation with my coworker Andrea Gall, who manages Portland Means Progress. And before I hand the mic over to her, we thought it would be helpful to ground the conversation in the history of our city and agency. And so a key part of the city of Portland's and Portland Means Progress history in the 1950s to the 1980s were the discriminatory practices that destabilized communities of color and people who are not landowners. The consequences of this history included wide disparity in employment, income, and wealth between white communities and communities of color in Multnomah County, and the lack of affordability in close-in neighborhoods. This resulted in gentrification, displacement, concentrations of poverty in Northeast, and increasingly East Portland. And sadly, this is not a unique story to Portland. This is a story that we're working hard to own ourselves, but we also anticipate that many of our peers on this call are also facing challenges of owning a racist history and trying to transition into a more equitable city. So this dichotomy is the context for our current strategic plan, which envisions Portland to be a globally competitive, equitable, and healthy city. We move into our most recent history in 2007 by adopting our first business and workforce equity policy, and this provided equitable opportunities for contractors and workers, particularly those who are people of color. And fast forwarding a bit more, in 2013, we adopted an equity policy which called for all projects, initiatives, and investments to generate equitable outcomes and establish a multicultural, anti-racist institutional framework for the organization. This set up our most recent strategic plan in 2015, which set an intentional focus on sharing the economic gains and addressing disparities and ensuring equitable benefits for all of the city that we serve, and for us to become a multicultural, anti-racist institution. Next slide, please. Looks like we have these flipped. If you could actually go back one. Let's go back one. Back one more, please. So this slide here, just to highlight some of the narrative I just provided, you see pictures of bulldozers which took down the homes of our African-American community members in order to build infrastructure for our city. And they were not the only ones that we displaced. We also displaced many other communities, Italian communities, Chinese American communities, Japanese American communities. We did not stop with that. And so it took a number of years to finally get to that place of building out, like I mentioned, a strategic plan in 2015 to start moving towards creating equality and equitable benefits for our community. And so if we go to the next slide again, that'd be great. So before we go into our initiative, Portland Means Progress, we wanted to give you a sense of how this fits into our equity programming. Our leader of our organization frequently says to us, when we're doing this work, we need to ask ourselves one question, and that is, who benefits from everything that we're doing? And so the shift that we're beginning to move towards is investing in things like the Mercatus Initiative, which includes an online directory and website that elevates the unique and universal narratives of entrepreneurs of color in Portland and connects the city and region with local talent, business, services, and products that come from these diverse entrepreneurs. We run the city's Enterprise Zone program, which is what I manage, where we have projects that have invested $1 billion in real estate and signed public benefit agreements, which have elements of corporate social responsibility or an environmental social governance practices, and it's tied to tax incentives. These agreements, every single one of them, have some form of equitable outcome attached to their incentive. We convene CEOs in the tech sector to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in practices in Portland tech firms. And we provide inspiring diversity grants to traded sector businesses to start their company's equity journey. So we look at the continuum of economic development practices, and we want to make sure that we're hitting it at every single level. So Andrea is going to take it from here on the next slide and kind of talk about an initiative that we launched. How long ago was it now, Andrea?
This initiative launched a couple of years ago. Thanks, Andy. My name's Andrea, and I'm going to talk about Portland Means Progress, which is one of the initiatives that we run through Prosper Portland. And back in 2017, shortly after our mayor was elected, he convened a council of economic advisors. And that group came together and really said, you know, the data is extremely clear about what's happening in Portland. And I think what's relevant is acknowledging that this is not unique to Portland. This is, most cities are facing this crisis. And really saying the economic disparities for communities of color are clear. And what we want to do is find a way to make it accessible and actionable for the private sector to engage in this work. And so through data-driven decision-making as well as work with community, we landed on these core actions as Portland Means Progress initiative. And so businesses sign up to pay a minimum living wage of at least $15 an hour across their organization. This is more than the minimum wage in the city of Portland. And then they commit to taking at least one of the following actions. One is to create work experiences for underrepresented youth and young professionals of color. One is to support businesses by purchasing goods and services by businesses owned by people of color. And the last is to create culture change by providing diversity, equity, and inclusion training internally for their staff and leadership. So businesses commit to paying a minimum of $15 an hour, and then at least one of those three actions as joining onto this initiative as a Portland Means Progress business. And so on the next slide, we kind of get into some of the data of how we landed on these specific actions, because the goal was to be data-driven in our decision-making and to also really focus on what is actionable and accessible for businesses. And so all these decisions were made pre-pandemic, really looking at the fact that in the city of Portland, at the time, 30,000 local youth were disengaged from school and work in the Portland metro area. Now, I anticipate that's more. We don't have that information yet. We partner with an initiative called Emerging Leaders Program, and they're 100% candidates of color that are college level and graduate level students. And they had over 900 applications last year, and were only able to place 14% of those applicants. And so we'll hear this narrative from businesses, hey, I'm having trouble accessing talent of color. And then we look at this data and we say, okay, the talent is out there. It is not a talent pipeline issue. The issue is how do we make those connections between businesses and the talent and the programming that already exists. We also partner with a program called Summer Work, and that's more with high school, age 16 to 24 youth in the city that are disconnected from work and school. And we found that after only one summer of engaging with Summer Work, youth were having 16% rate gain of higher education and higher educational engagement. That's a huge payback for only an 8 to 10 week engagement with a business. And so we're seeing these really compelling reasons on both the demand side and the supply side of why businesses should engage in this work. And nationwide, we're seeing that 67% of interns get offered full-time employment after their internship. So again, from a business perspective, really as we're looking at talent pipeline issues, these work experiences are a really compelling way to access talent in the city and for us as a city to retain that talent. So how do we get more businesses to sign on? On the next slide, we look at purchasing from local businesses owned by people of color. Really, Andy talked about the Mercatus directory, which is one of the initiatives through Prosper Portland. There's nearly 600 businesses owned by people of color that are in the Portland metro area on that directory. According to the City of Portland business licenses, there's over 12,000 businesses owned by people of color in the city. And so we have these businesses that are purchasing businesses, and we have local businesses owned by people of color. And so how do we make these connections for purchasing businesses and Portland Means Progress businesses to shift their purchasing to be local and to intentionally purchase from businesses owned by people of color? And on the last data-driven slide, we look at culture change work. There's this really strong narrative about the city of Portland being the whitest city in America. And if you look at this upcoming wave of workforce, 47% of Portlanders between the ages of 15 and 19 identify as people of color. That is significant, especially given this really strong narrative about the city of Portland being the whitest city in America. And so how do we support our businesses to be prepared for this wave of workforce, as well as to shift their internal workplace cultures to retain the talent they currently have? So it's kind of a both and. How do you look at your current workplace and make it inclusive and provide a workplace that people want to be and want to be retained? And as we look at this workforce coming in, to be a workplace that the young workforce coming in want to join. And of course, the data is incredibly compelling about why you should want to do it from a business perspective as well, in addition to simply being the right thing to do and being a thing that we want to work places that you want to work. Additionally, we're seeing that you have a 30% higher revenue per employee for employers with inclusive talent practices. You have more innovative teams. You have more compelling access to markets if you have diverse teams that work for you and that want to work for you. And if you go to the next slide, this was the initiative as it was. And then the pandemic hit. And there was a global movement for racial justice with the murder of George Floyd. And so this is a picture of protests happening in Portland. And really there was this movement to say, now I want to double down on my commitments towards racial justice in the city of Portland. And so I will say, even with the pandemic, but perhaps I should say especially with the pandemic, businesses were really stepping up and saying, I want to do this work and I want to commit to this work. and I want to find ways that it's accessible, but also actionable and accountable for me to do so. And so really Portland Means Progress, in 2019, we had 50 early adopter businesses. Soon you'll hear from Kimberly, who's with PGE, who's one of our early adopter businesses. And since 2020, we've had an additional over 40 businesses sign on. And so that's really compelling that in this current moment that businesses are in crisis mode, that even if, especially with the current moment, they're signing on and saying, I want to take on additional commitments and be held accountable to those commitments. And so if you go to the next slide, we'll look at what are we offering in 2020 to our businesses, acknowledging that we're in the middle of the pandemic, the ways of working are changing, but that businesses are really stepping up and saying, I want to do this work and I want to commit to it. So in March of this year, right before the pandemic hit, we rolled out a culture change roadmap. We developed that in partnership with 16 businesses and 4 equity practitioners. PGE was one of those businesses that helped us develop it. We can share the link to that. But really it supports businesses on how do you move forward in your culture change work towards an equitable workplace. We've been transitioning our work experiences to remote. Again, PGE has been partnering with the Emerging Leaders Program and been supporting interns through that. We also rolled out how to be an inclusive and effective manager training, centering our values during the pandemic. So how do we lean into racial justice and hold true to our values during crisis mode? We partnered with businesses and used our budget to distribute PPE to BIPOC-owned businesses. We made connections for purchasing businesses to increase their purchasing with Mercatus businesses. And we're about to roll out a series called Accountability and Racial Equity for businesses. And that's really looking at, businesses are coming out with these really bold statements in support and in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And so how do we get from statement to action, as well as being transparent about what we're doing and sharing that out in a measurable way to show that we're actually advancing racial justice in the city of Portland. And so I'm really excited to pass over to Kimberly, who's with PGE. PGE has been deeply engaged in all 3 of the actions, as well as really taking it to the next level in terms of not only owning the work for themselves, but then taking that next step to call on more businesses to join the work, because this is really a space where individual businesses can't measurably move forward the entire city. It's only collectively that we can do that. And so really having partners in this work is how we'll drive it forward. So with that, I'll pass over to Kimberly.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Andy and Joe, for setting this up so nicely. Like Prosper Portland's presentation, our work in PG Project Zero began before COVID. But like many things, COVID really illuminated, yes, pun intended, the inequities in our community and made this work even more important. So as you see from this slide, it is our initiative to empower the next generation to create cleaner, greener communities. And if we can go to the next slide, PGE has Portland General Electric, as we like to say when we're talking to people all over the country. Just our acronym can get confusing. But Portland General Electric is a local investor-owned utility. We have had a long-term commitment to community partnerships, and specifically around addressing the climate emergency and building a clean energy future. For the last 130 plus years, we've been part of the Portland community and the Portland region, down into Salem and over into Clackamas County. We have plants and that are in Central Oregon and Eastern Oregon and up in Columbia County. And so where we have our footprint, we have been listening to and engaging with our communities for a long time. And education is key, and so our young people and our students have been the voice of many initiatives that we've engaged in. And Project Zero really focuses in on the voices that we heard about a year ago when students at Portland Public Schools walked out, and then other school districts around the state followed. And then we had a big Climate Friday in September with Greta Thunberg leading the way, saying we need to do something about this. And we can go to the next slide. PGE had been working on sort of acting on our purpose, which is to advance or power the advancement of society. And really hearing the young people's voices, it helped us really to frame 3 different ways in which PGE Project Zero could build on powerful partnerships. The one I'm going to spend the most time talking to you about today, though, is this Pathways to Green Jobs for Disconnected Young Adults. but I thought it would be helpful to frame the other two pillars just so you can see the total context. So we'll go to the next slide. The first pillar is around education, and education centers around this Portland Public Schools partnership to really develop an open source comprehensive K-12 climate literacy curriculum, and within that curriculum to really focus on that early part of career development. You can't see it if you can't do it. Equity really begins in seeing yourself being able to accomplish anything that you want to accomplish, and so many of our students don't see themselves as scientists. They don't see themselves as data analysts. They don't see themselves as engineers or in the trades because they don't see people that look like them in those careers. And so looking at climate literacy in a fully integrated way, we've been looking at all the different roles in which our energy sector is playing in fighting the climate emergency. And so helping from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade, see the many ways in which students can engage as well as build career pathways. We can go to the next slide. We also have been building on how our employees like and have historically shown up in communities, and we have built on that. So we've really focused in on the key theme that we're talking about today, which is equity, and in particular for low-income communities, for Indigenous populations, for Black communities and communities of color, who often experience firsthand the negative health effects and environmental impacts of climate change, but are also the last voices that are heard at the table as to how we can engage in making those impacts different. Andy showed a slide about the communities in Northeast Portland that lost their homes, and other communities during what we called at that time economic development and economic growth. In fact, so those communities were then redlined and put in other areas, and most of those areas are still highly industrialized areas. They're areas that have the lowest amount of tree canopy, and we know that tree canopy improves air quality, but we also know that it improves the temperature of that community, which has health impacts as well as impacts around energy usage. So we're working with various organizations to both do some research as well as environmental impact projects to strengthen equitable access to both parks and green spaces, but also to increase the urban tree canopy, thereby improving air quality and some of these hot spots that we're seeing in some of our major cities. This will go to the next slide. And linking all of that, so education, right, starting with our youngest and then moving up to our teenagers and our young adults. We've already heard from Prosper Portland that there's a disconnected amount of young adults and young people, teenagers in Oregon, 30,000 of them that are not working and they're not in school, which means they're unemployed and they're disconnected. And there are a variety of reasons why they're disconnected, but when you dig into the research and the data, you find that a lot of it has to do with experiencing barriers. And there are barriers because school is not a welcoming place. There are barriers because, again, you can't see it if you can't do it if you can't see it. So there's not representation of people that look like them in the field. There are barriers because there's not mentorship. There are barriers because they are experiencing houselessness. They are experiencing food insecurity. So we worked first and foremost by gathering youth development organizations and environmental nonprofits around the table to say, okay, how can we address this as a collective? And what is the way in which we can sort of build a connector between the workforce programs that many of these students are in and getting actually hired in a career track, full-time job, especially for this disconnected group of young people who don't necessarily then have a college degree, that are not necessarily on a college track, and for in many ways need to work if they're going to continue to support their families. So we narrowed the focus of that 16 to 24-year-old opportunity youth, as we call it in the data, to 20 to 24-year-olds, so that they're a little bit older. They've probably gone through many workforce programs, and then we partnered with those workforce programs to say, who among your graduates are ready for a career but still need to basically finish off, right? Really polish up their work readiness, build those socio-emotional skills, those team building skills, time management skills. And something that we're learning from the young adults that are part of this program is that that idea of personal brand and reflection on goal setting, and how do you set your personal vision for yourself and then make that attainable. If you'll go on to the next slide. We then took these young adults starting in August with these community partners, and then go on to the next slide. And we said, okay, from August until February, you're going to be working full time. You're going to get $15 an hour during that time. And you're also going to be part of a cohort. And that cohort is going to provide you with these various finishing skills, if you will. The goals then for Project Zero overall, I think we can go past this slide a little bit more quickly, is about connecting kindergartners, connecting young people. I wanted you to meet Ivan, but I also am conscious of time. So I'm just going to note that one of the early assignments that we gave the young people was to create a social media video about their work. And I think if you push play, it should play. Oh, except we can't hear him. That's okay. We can move on to the next slide. I can kind of describe what that. So Ivan comes from, he is the exact young adult that we are talking about. He's 20 years old. He just got his first apartment. He's been in various workforce programs. But he's incredibly purpose-driven and has a passion for what he wants to do with his life, but hasn't seen a pathway to do that. And so this opportunity is giving him that 6 months of working with an environmental nonprofit. He's working with Verde, and then they are a culturally specific Latinx, Latino, Latina organization in the Cully neighborhood of Portland that is working very much on community-based economic development. And he's working with them on their outreach. He's working with them on landscape. So there's actually a skill that he's learning. And then at the end of that time, he's also being given the opportunity to connect with a mentor at PGE. He's being given an opportunity through that mentor to connect with other professionals that are in the kind of work that he wants to do. He sees himself being an environmental justice lawyer, and not sure how to get there if he still needs to work and make a living. And so we've been helping him think about those pathways. If you'll go to the next slide. And that is where the destination employers start. And this is where we reached out to Portland Means Progress. We wanted to find other employers like PGE that had signed the pledge to do this work. And we wanted to find them to begin to create a circle of what we're calling destination employers, so that at the end of this 6 months, the 10 interns that we now have working at 5 different environmental nonprofits will have the opportunity to get hired in a career track full-time job with a company, either business or industry or the trades, that also has a green collar or sustainable focus in the work that they are doing. And we are guaranteeing that out of this program that they are hiring talented and capable adults who have basically spent this kind of pre-apprentice time doing this both hands-on work and the professional development work that's needed to be prepared for this next step. If you'll go to the next slide. So we've been reaching out to employers in the various industries and businesses that you see here, and trades as well. And that connects with our own work in terms of the cultural roadmap and recognizing the racial equity journey and making a public commitment to recruiting and developing and community partnerships. And thinking also about our supplier and pipeline. So many of these organizations, one of them is City of Roses. It's an African-American waste management company. It is owned and operated and has been owned and operated by a Black family in this community. And they have a real strong commitment to green, clean, sustainable work practices, but also to partnership. And the head of that organization partnered with many other business leaders to create a call to action to the business community around equitable economic development. They called this op-ed "Invisible Me," and we can put it in the chat, a link to that. I think it's really important to think about partnership in a lot of different areas, and this was one of those partners. We'll go on to the next slide. So the next steps for the destination employers are to join us by signing a pledge to provide an informational interview opportunity, to then do a deeper experience through a job shadow or other workforce experience, and then to interview one or more of these Project Zero interns, again, for a career track full-time job that they would then hire in February. Ideally, we would have 5 to 7 or 8 employers that sign this pledge, and hopefully we would be able to make the match with 80% of the 10 of the young people that have started this program. We already know that some of them will come through this experience and decide that they want to further education, as we saw with the summer works interns as well, that they want to go on to college, and getting a job right away is not what they're going to do, and we'll continue to give them that support on the other side. PGE has also made a commitment, especially on our trade side, to really cultivate and hopefully recruit one or more of these Project Zero interns into one of our either our trades or through plant management or plant operations, which is also the operations side of the business. We'll go to the next slide. I think that's the end of my presentation. It is. And there are a lot of different dots to connect in the city of Portland, and in particular, I painted the dot to the business community and the leadership within the Black community that really sort of came to light after George Floyd's murder and the other murders earlier this year and the ones that were before that. It really came to light in our own equity work at Portland General Electric, and then there's partnership opportunities through the Portland Clean Energy Fund and helping connect our community-based organizations to dollars to do their own workforce development. So there's a lot of different connectors, but I would say at the core of it for PGE is that we wanted to look for a way to use our philanthropic dollars, a way that it goes beyond just giving the money to put a Band-Aid on the community, but rather giving the money and then creating a table of partnership to move the dial. 10 young people at a time, yes, but to move that dial toward that wealth creation that that we've already heard Prosper Portland talk about within Black, Indigenous, people of color communities. And this time is more. There's no time like a time when there is crisis for re-looking at how we have been doing things and rebuilding systems. And this is the way that we are doing that at this time.
Kimberly, that's outstanding. It's such a comprehensive framework for how an employer can engage on so many of the most pressing issues of our time. And I'm struck. I was struck by both your remarks and then what Andrea and Andy said around just the level of effort to build up the partnerships that seem to undergird, all of these efforts, right? I mean, there are, and to me, what stood out when I first heard about the initiative was that it was this kind of interesting mechanism to bring scale to a lot of the work that, those organizations have been doing for a while, and then try to attach as many employers to it as possible. Because my sense is that employers look around and they see a lot of options as to how to engage. And I think sometimes that the amount of options or the amount of asks overwhelms them, and bringing some kind of clarity to the complex thicket of these organizations is something that I think Portland Means Progress has tried to do. So I guess my question for you, Kimberly, is just when you, as an early adopter, when you go to another business and you say, and they're like, oh, this seems interesting, and they may say, well, I'm kind of doing my thing, here, and this is the way we've approached these issues. Like, do I need to attach into this other thing? Or like, what's your argument for why doing this as a collective, or at least communicating progress as a collective, matters for the private sector? Because I think you're seeing a lot of like individualized efforts on the part of businesses, but what's your argument to them about why they should attach into something that the city is trying to drive?
One of the things that employers feel the most, I think, pain points about or challenges about in terms of engaging in workforce development as it pertains to education, right? So there's education comes along, and there's this idea of career-connected learning or work-based learning, but there's a disconnect between the work-based learning and actually getting that young person hired. And we felt that as a pain point. And so coming to another business and saying, hey, we recognize that's a pain point. And PGE has worked with these nonprofit partners who are really good at the developing of the young person's talent. But they also recognize from their side the pain point of, then how do we plug those two things together? And we did a lot of research on the national scale around workforce programs and found that many of them were run as nonprofits. And then you have the business community, and they're not talking the same language. So having a business partner who takes the lead on the convening really enables us to speak business to business. And so then we can say, not only did we vet this program and chose to invest in this program and therefore the development of these young people, but we can speak your language as a fellow business leader in terms of the value of that and why you should join us in taking up the mantle and then furthering the experience of this young person by hiring them. So it really is kind of as a translator. It's that's marketing 101. It's also communications 101. Know your audience, right, and then bring forth the right speaker to make that clear. And it's not to put nonprofit down. It's just that we as business community often don't speak the same language. So bringing the nonprofit partners to the table so that they could create the program and at the same time hear PGE's input, and then to be able to say to our partners, destination employers, we've done this work. We know what these young people are capable of. Join us.
It makes complete sense, and that you're versed in the language of the value proposition in a way that a nonprofit may not be, right? And that's just where the translation becomes really important. I'm curious and while I'm asking these questions, I should note that for our audience members, you can put your questions in the chat. Happy to answer those as well. But I'm interested just of the new companies, Andrea, that are coming post-protest, post-COVID, who from those companies ends up coming? Is it the CEOs, or is it a head of HR? Is it a strategy person? Is it a CSR person? Like, for folks that are listening and who are like, okay, who within companies seems to be the warmest lead for something like this? Like, what would you tell them?
I think it's interesting because part of the goal of Portland Means Progress is to get, really the vision is every single business in the city of Portland signed on, which is an opportunity and a huge challenge, because in our 50 early adopter businesses, we had businesses ranging in size from 3 employees to 15,000. We're finding in the new businesses that have signed up in 2020 that they're ranging in size from 1 person up until like 1,000. And so who's engaging is so variable based on the size of the business. With these really large businesses, they have full-time dedicated folks to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or full-time HR folks, or full-time corporate social responsibility. And they're really the right contacts with the large organizations because they know what they're already doing and can tell us clean and clear, here are our gaps, here's where we're struggling, or here's where we want to call more businesses to join us. With these sub 10 person employee businesses, we're finding that the CEO wants to engage and bring someone else along. And usually that other someone is an internal champion, someone who's just simply passionate about the work. They don't have something special tagged to their job title, but they're like, I work here. And it's interesting to work with these really small businesses because the level of autonomy that they have to move things forward is really fun and exciting and nimble, because they simply say yes. And the CEO nods their head and they go do it. And so it's been interesting to engage across that scale to try to build an initiative that serves all those folks. And what we're finding is by having multiple, to your point, too many options can be too many, but having multiple options where folks can tag in, because a very small business says, oh, intentional purchasing, I'm shifting my printing right now, 100% of it done, right? And so they might struggle to hire on, whereas PGE says, we're targeting getting 50, 60 young adults into work experience in the next 5 years, which is something maybe a 2-person business can't commit to. So it's really variable, but that it has been something we're working on, is we want to get someone as high up in the organization as possible who's also the right person to implement.
Yeah, it strikes me that you've got, for very small businesses, they are able to connect into something for which they will not have the cost structure or the business model to do on their own, right? So you're like providing them what you should be providing, which is somewhat of a public good, right? Like you're a city, so it just makes sense that they could benefit from a lower marginal cost of doing something like this than them standing up what PGE did, right? PGE has the resources to lead on this because they have Kimberly and the dedication and the human capital to do it. My question is just also maybe for Andy. You've got economic development organizations spend a lot of time interacting with the private sector, right? Like they work with and through the private sector to get the outcomes they want. But it strikes me that for this, you all had to make two sides of a marketplace. You had employers on one side, and you had, again, kind of community-based organizations, the workforce system, maybe even the school system, right? And I'm wondering just how much time did it take? Like if you're someone who's listening to this and is like, oh, I'm interested, like what's step zero? It seems like there's a lot of work that has to go in between what the city did, building up those relationships with the nonprofits who were the kind of sources for diverse talent, or maybe had different types of community-based connections than what Prosper Portland had. So can you talk a little bit about the level of effort to build those relationships with the nonprofits?
Yeah, so Andrea, 13 partners help us raise this up. Is that accurate? Yeah, so we had 13 nonprofits and other entities, government organizations sign on as signatories to the initiative, Portland Means Progress. That took a while to get that process rolling. In terms of Portland Means Progress, it was a very, very fast-moving initiative. I think we had it up and running within 3-6 months. That said, it was built on years of community engagement and outreach that took, many conversations in the community to build trust around how government or an economic development organization with the racist history that we have, why should we even be in the room having this discussion around building equitable economies, right? So there was a lot of work that we had to do around meals and coffee and community engagement opportunities where we sat down with them and said, to Kimberly's point, what are your pain points? What do you need as a community? If we were to bring businesses to you to do work with you, what are the things that you want? And so Portland Means Progress leaned on some of our other initiatives that I mentioned, where we already did a bunch of that work that allowed us to then pick up the phone and say, hey, we think we want to take this to the next level. Are you interested in doing this with us? And it was a really neat experience to watch the community own it. It was a pretty clear message that they wanted this to not be something that just Prosper Portland did, but this was an initiative driven by the community, for the community, with us as convener, with us helping to kind of connect those dots in a ways that's the space that we can move in. Government, we can move as a regulator, or we can move as a convener and a relationship builder. And so I think we've seen this culture shift internally of wanting to be a relationship builder. And that's where, again, we leaned pretty heavily on years of work, really hard work to get to this point. And then we were able to move pretty quickly because of some of those really strong relationships.
Kimberly, go ahead.
Joe, I just wanted to add to that because I think that it's similar from the perspective of Portland General Electric. And I would say if I was to give advice to other companies and other communities, that your corporate social responsibility team or your community affairs team, whatever is the philanthropic arm of your corporation or your company, is a good place to start because we had, and continue to have strong relationships with our community-based organizations. And we had started many years ago, I guess I would say 3 or 4 years ago, in redefining what that philanthropic relationship looked like and really sort of leaning more into a trust-based philanthropy, which is much more about partnership and much more about inclusion and having the conversations with the community-based organizations rather than top-down philanthropy, which is we have the money, we're going to give it to you. And so because we had already started to build that strong base, when we said to some of the youth development organizations and these environmental nonprofits that we had strong relationships with, hey, do you want to come to the table? We have this idea and we don't even know if it's an idea yet, but we want to tackle something and we want to talk with you about it. And then continue the conversation. They were very willing to do that. And then we went one step further and said, for your expertise and for your capacity, we're also part of funding of this project is funding you to participate. So you're not just coming to the table again and again and again as part of this community of practice to tell us what you're really good at, but you're coming as a content expert, and we are paying you the way we would pay a consultant to help us build this program. So I think there was two things, both a strong relationship and then the philanthropic aspect of acknowledging that we are making an investment across the spectrum, not just for the young people, but also investing in our nonprofit sector to build capacity for the work that they're doing.
The last point that you made there about community-based organizations essentially being paid for their expertise is something that I've noticed that philanthropy has led on. And I just wanted to stress that point because I think for economic development organizations who are not necessarily philanthropies, they don't have budgets to do this, should probably know that if step one is to go talk kind of to the community, to organizations that perhaps view that they have been under-resourced historically and are sensitive or perhaps straight up annoyed or angry about being asked to come kind of give free advice to what they perceive to be kind of dominant organizations locally that have received funding, we should just be mindful of those dynamics. And but there's a tension because economic development organizations don't always have like partnership budgets, right? A lot of this work happens where I come to your meetings, you come to my meetings, like we kind of do it because it's in the collective interest of the community or the region. And I would just stress to them then that, you should go to your local philanthropy, your community foundation and say, look, like we want to bring a different type of table together, but we don't have the resources immediately to, Andy, you'd mentioned a lot of coffees, a lot of food. I mean, sometimes it's not expensive, but sometimes I think the norms do seem to be shifting around here where it's not just, hey, I need a lunch or a cup of coffee. If people want to be paid for their insights and to be partners and to receive the resources to do the work. And for these new types of coalitions, like that is something that every region is going to be a little different in their norms, but I just wanted to highlight it because it seems like it's really important if you want to do this going forward and make it sustainable. I have a question from one audience member who asked the 30% increase in revenue per employee. So this was, I think, in the folks in Portland's deck for employers that adopt the diverse workforce program is significant. I think he was referring to kind of inclusive hiring practices or broadly. And the question is, how was this achieved? And I know you may have been citing like industry research, but maybe just say a little bit more about who did that study and what you took away from it, Andrea.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it is really compelling. That's from a Deloitte study, and as we were building the initiative, we wanted it to be both driven by community desire as well as data-driven of what works in terms of community outcomes and outcomes-driven, as well as for businesses to have a compelling reason to sign on. And really, there's a lot of dotted lines you can draw of why these inclusive talent practices lead to better business outcomes. I think the first one that we saw really compelling information on, and again, this is not our program specific, this is across nationwide. One is access to new markets. I think we're really seeing, a good example is the tech sector, that the Latinx community consumes technology at a much higher rate than their peers, and they're the most underrepresented in the tech industry. And so that's very compelling for tech companies who want to diversify their workforce. You can also look at the negative outcomes of groupthink if you do not have diverse teams and diverse ways of thinking, but it's not just about the demographics of the team, it's about a way of being on the team, that individuals on the team have the space to be able to bring their ideas to the forefront and to have those ideas be received and used. And then I think the other really compelling piece is we saw a lot of compelling data around retention, or even worse, really just lack of retention and the cost associated with that. And obviously, I think people have in their minds how expensive it is to backfill positions that are really high up in organizations, the cost of backfilling a CEO position. But as you look throughout an organization, the costs are vast in terms of knowledge management and backfilling. And so we really saw that there's these dotted lines to all these reasons. And I will say too, in addition to that business reason, we also always want to put right up in front, it's also the right thing to do. We should want to have inclusive workplaces and places where people have a sense of belonging. And I think that that's something that we've been working with in our messaging to make sure that it's not this message of dollar signs over people's heads. Those dollar signs are quite certainly there. I mean, it's really compelling, and it will be inauthentic if the business reason for signing on is strictly dollar signs, right? And so how do we advance racial equity, both because it's a good business decision as well as being the right thing to do?
Kimberly, you got a thought about that?
I was just going to build on that and say that, I mentioned the corporate social responsibility or philanthropy being sort of the leaders in the company to kind of get things going, but you really do want to use that to influence the leadership and tie it to strategy. So data like 30% increases in revenue is definitely a key point, but the value of having sort of a fully integrated sort of community outreach function within a diversity, equity, and inclusion office, within your the way that you look at your sort of supply chain, the way that you look at developing and recruiting your future employers, but then also the way that you are developing leadership within your company. All of those are factors in creating not just an inclusive workplace, but also strengthening the value once the employees are there. So in terms of retention, and then strengthening the value of the community's perception of what your work is. And community recognizes, to Andrea's point, when things are not authentic, right? So really having that authentic curiosity, I would say, and leading within BIPOC communities that say, you have the lived experience, we have something we need to understand, or want to understand about that lived experience in order to serve you better. And so how do we have those authentic and truthful conversations back and forth?
This is a question for Andy. You had mentioned earlier, and of course, keep coming with the questions if folks in the audience have them, but I have no shortage of them. Andy, you had mentioned like government can be a convener, it can be a regulator. And it can also be kind of an incentivizer in a way, right? You had mentioned your enterprise zone. Can you talk about how that, which is, you mentioned incentives tied to what you call public benefit agreements, but are not dissimilar from community benefit agreements, and how the role of incentivizer can guide private sector behavior more in this direction. And then like in terms of a sustainability question, like, do you think the companies that you incentivize that have maybe started to go through this, how are they thinking about it? Are they saying, okay, that was part of an incentive kind of transaction, and I'm thinking about it, but I don't feel like I'm jumping on board really aggressively? Or do they kind of go through it and they say, okay, actually this is maybe self-sustaining, like this is just something that we need to do for all the reasons that Andrea said earlier, that's just going to make our business stronger. And I'm just wondering, as you've gotten more of a sample size with those public benefit agreements, like what happens to those companies, 1 to 3 years into having signed one?
Yeah, so I'm thinking back about one of the first ones that we did a number of years ago, where racial equity wasn't at the heart of our agreements, but still transected with it, and that was around providing transportation support for employees. And so there's a very large distributor here in town. They're all over the country, and they paid for 75% of a bus pass for all their employees, and their ridership went up drastically. 5 years later, the program's still in place, even though it's only in one of their 2 distribution hubs across the country, because of the high demand for it within their employee base. And it had become part of just kind of their package. And so we're seeing that adoption of business practices. Another example of that would be one company brought in childcare services for their employees, because we know that childcare is a major issue for employers. And it kicked off a conversation within their employee base where they were very excited that their employer was taking care of them and their kids, right? And so it's creating these really good moments of, we really wanted to do this. We didn't know how to start. Now we have some tools to do this differently, and we have an incentive to do it. And I think once a company takes on some of those things, that's the culture change piece that when we talked about our equity work, it's a culture change roadmap. There's no one entry point into this. There's 30 different ways you can join this conversation. And it could be around something as simple as transportation needs for your employees, which is a business need because you also need your employees to get to work, and so it becomes a business need as well as a community need as well as an employee need. And when you start aligning those 3 things together, I think Kimberly and crew down there are doing an awesome job with that, of aligning both business need and community need. That's where we see this amazing nexus where it's really not a hard sell. Like, it's really not an incentive in that sense. I say that with our tax incentives, companies are probably going to invest anyways. They're going to do what they're going to do. And we're now getting them to do this with us. And that's, again, the convening part, the incentive/convening goes hand in hand.
That makes sense. And I'm struck at something that Kimberly was in your slide deck, where you had within your company, I think it was this matchmaking, right, between youth and mentors. And the value proposition for the youth is pretty clear, right? Like, that's an awesome experience for them. How does PGE think about the value proposition for the mentor? Because I've seen data that suggests when employees feel like their employer is aligned with their values and they see very tangible ways that they can act on those values within their community, that it's a good feeling. It makes you feel good to work at that place, and arguably it makes them more happy, productive employees, which at the end of the day is a good thing to have because it's a talent-driven economy. I don't know. That's my theory. What do you think about your mentors? That, do you see it as almost a talent retention thing for them? I know it's the right thing to do, but I'm trying to also think about the bottom line a little bit. Do you think they're a little bit likelier to stay at PG&E if they have this type of opportunity?
Absolutely. When we developed this program, one of the key things we wanted to make sure that we did was engage employees for the exact reason that you said, Joe. And for PGE Project Zero specifically, we're already seeing the benefits of that. So there are 10 champions, and each of them are paired with one of the interns. And already they are excited about telling their coworkers that they're a champion. Coworkers that are hearing about this said, "How come I didn't hear about being able to apply to be a champion?" Of course, we did internal marketing, but a lot of people sort of missed it, and then COVID was happening, so there's just a lot of other things. But yeah, so there's that. But then there's also the development of the employee and the further connection that they have to PGE as a leader in the community, and walking the talk. So we had a meeting right after the sorry, I get a little emotional, but so right after the indictment didn't come down in Louisville, in the Breonna Taylor case, and instead of jumping directly into the meeting, we had a check-in because some people really wanted to talk about it. And the champions immediately went to this conversation on behalf of the young adults. They were having their own sort of learning and processing, but they were also thinking about how are these young adults learning and processing this moment in history, in this moment in time. And it became very clear that that PGE giving space for that, or Portland General Electric giving space for that conversation, was part and parcel because of the program. So we had made a commitment to serving a certain percentage of BIPOC students, and we more than exceeded that. So 60% of these interns are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And that means that the students themselves or the young adults themselves are bringing these things up. They are challenging us to think this way, and we are then challenged to use our adult experience to help them continue to move through the conversation. So the short answer is absolutely, employees engaged, feeling strongly committed to the fact that we are the company that is doing something that they feel passionate about. But then also it goes one step further because PGE Project Zero also connected to our corporate strategy. So, you know, our clean future, clean energy future, specifically decarbonization, electrification, and smart grid integration, this program is plugged right into that. And so they can also see how what they're doing is helping the company reach our corporate goals.
Right, which is all the literature suggests that's what makes for a motivated employee, is if they are seeing their work in the broader strategy of the company. And I think this applies as well for something like this. So thank you for sharing that. This is probably a question for either Andrea or Andy. And the question is, how are elected officials brought to the table in this effort? Maybe leadership, resources, just talk a little bit about how the politicians play into this.
Yeah, the Portland Means Progress initiative was first born out of conversation of the Mayor's Council of Economic Advisors, and we've really benefited from the mayor's willingness to help carry this forward as well. So especially with that early adopter phase, when we were still branding it, it didn't have a name yet, and we were really calling on businesses to say, hey, will you join us in this work? Oh, and by the way, we're still defining what this is, right? Like, we're still meeting with community members. We're still figuring out how businesses will engage. And businesses would say, well, how do I report back on what I did? And we'd say, we'll let you know, and you can work on that with us. I mean, that's kind of a hard sell. And so to have the mayor in partnership with us to say, you know, work with us on this, please, and to be a partner in that work was really meaningful. And as we're moving forward, the city council and commissioners are joining us as partners too, and really talking about it is helpful. Because 2 years ago, if you had said, what's Portland Means Progress, nobody knew what it was. And now we're having businesses organically coming to us, both because of partners like PGE who are actively reaching out, but also it just being a part of the narrative. And so I would really encourage folks. Also, we have general fund dollars to keep the initiative moving. That was something really important to our community-based partners. They said, you know, if this is not funded, to your point, Joseph, if this is not funded and this is something that's not going to be a long-term solution, then I'm very hesitant to join as a founding partner. And so to have the city say, this is something we are invested in financially, staff time, all of it, then the community members said, okay, if this is not like a one-off political thing that's going to go away in a few years, then I'm in. But if this is a short-term Band-Aid, I'm not in. And so that's been really meaningful for it to have the weight and the depth that it needs to be meaningful. Andy, is there anything that you'd add to that piece?
Yeah, I think the beautiful thing about how this one went down, the mayor took a very strong position on this. This is something we can do around social equity in community with business, and it was still at the same time driven by community and business with the politicians. And so having the community voice lead the conversation really gave our leadership the backing that they needed to get the ongoing funds going for it. So I think that there is definitely a good partnership that happened out of that.
I think the combination of the bully pulpit and the resources are powerful, and I think we're all left to wonder the state of, city fiscal, situation going forward. And, one role for public-private intermediaries like an economic development organization or a chamber is to buttress public support with support from corporates who think this is an important thing to do, right? I think as long as you have certainty that there's going to be resources to do this over an extended period of time, that's really important, as you said, to get people to buy in. We have another question. This is for Kimberly. And the question is the response from companies different towards the African American community versus other brown communities? I think the response maybe from companies you've talked to about either business owner, like small business owners, or the type of talent pipelines that you're talking about, we've talked about this kind of as a group, BIPOC or people of color, and it's an interesting question.
It is an interesting question. I have not seen any difference. I will say that one of the things we heard from the African American business community was connected to this op-ed that I mentioned in the Business Journal, which is it would be helpful to have some economic support for supporting these disconnected youth. So for a small to mid-sized Black-owned business, and I'll speak specifically about Black-owned business because this is the community that I heard from on this point, having that sort of paid internship by a larger company like Portland General Electric enables them to then cultivate that young person the way that we were supporting the nonprofit. And so for many community members in the Portland region that I understand, there's a lot of community economic development that is given specifically to nonprofits. So you have a lot of nonprofit sort of Black or other people of color that are leading and promoting culturally specific nonprofit work. And the philanthropic community is all about investing. The corporate community is all about investing in that. And yet you have small to mid-sized Black-owned businesses who are not moving forward economically. The wealth is not being built. And so from the Black community specifically, it's like, how are we investing in rather than putting a Band-Aid on community need? And so that has been specifically different. I think that from the perspective of the destination employers we reached out to are our peer organizations. And so our Vice President of Public Affairs reached out to organizations where he sits on a board, and they are similar size. So they could absorb a new employee in a career track entry-level job much more easily than a small to mid-sized organization that is owned and operated by Black, Indigenous, or person of color, because that company is already struggling to build their wealth, and being able to hire someone might not be as easy. So I don't know if that answers the question. So yeah, there's definitely an ease with which a larger, more established, for want of a better way, dominant culture business can say, yes, we can hire for $15 an hour, 5 or 6 of disconnected youth out of this program, whereas a mid-sized or small Black-owned or Latinx-owned business may not have the resources to do so, even though that might be the exact place that young person is needed and the exact place where that young person would be nurtured and grow, and that company would see those same revenue increasers by having a diverse workforce or a workforce that looks like them. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a great answer. And I'm wondering, as you think about the supply or procurement part of the 3-part framework that you all are working on, are you seeing, I've heard, as you think about supplier diversification, that one of the things that is just a a secular trend is consolidation, supplier consolidation. So, particularly bigger companies want fewer, maybe larger suppliers to be able to operate nationally and globally. And I guess, do you observe any of that in Portland, where there's an interest in diversification in terms of the demographics of the business owner, but a sense that businesses owned by people of color tend to be smaller than white-owned businesses. So there's this scale versus diversity thing, which won't always exist. There's plenty of larger Black owner, Hispanic owner, Indigenous-owned companies, but just the numbers are what they are. And it strikes me that as we have this kind of push where I think a lot of corporates are trying to think about their supply chains, they're going to be thinking about, okay, well, I could actually consolidate into a larger footprint of diverse business owners because I'm going to be putting more resources on fewer companies. But do you have an observation about how that's playing out in Portland, or maybe Kimberly with PGE's own supply chain?
I can speak to, interestingly, out of the new businesses that have signed on since the pandemic, I'd have to look at the data, but I think almost a third of new businesses signing on to be Portland Means Progress businesses are owned by people of color. And so that's been really interesting, and kind of asking folks, what is compelling you to sign on? A lot of folks are, one business just said, as a minority-owned business, it's important to me to purchase from minority-owned businesses and to do so visibly, and to speak about how we're doing that to share with more businesses. I think I'd be interested to hear from Andy and Kimberly about the purchasing shift. My view is obviously quite biased because I'm specifically working with businesses who are committing to shift their purchasing to be local and to diversify their supply chains. But I do think that the pandemic showed weaknesses in supply chains that made a lot of businesses really say, I really want to revisit my supply chain because I had such issues once the pandemic hit. And so a lot of them said, I really want to purchase more local because I think that will disrupt my supply chain less as issues happen globally. That's one thing we definitely saw, particularly as we were looking at shortages of PPE and local businesses started shifting what they made. And a lot of purchasing businesses said, I kind of wish I had these relationships before the pandemic so that I could have been more nimble to shift my purchasing where there weren't gaps in supplies. But I can hand over to Andy on that piece.
Yeah, I think what, speaking from my enterprise zone hat on, we have purchasing agreements with every enterprise zone company as well, so 60 of these. And I'd say it's pretty common that their supply chain is twofold. One, their goods and services that they make, whether they're making a widget or what have you, it's usually a national supplier that they're going through, or if they have multiple locations, they don't even make that call. They are interested in willing and shifting their purchases on their local procurement for local issues or local things that they need to fill goods and services. And so that's really, I think, from an opportunity, there is always an opportunity for businesses to shift how they're purchasing. And that intentionality is really always on the table. And that's where Portland Means Progress and other related programs like Mercatus gives a business a chance to, it's not an easy button. I'm not going to use that word necessarily, but it is an intentional button where you can say, here's my list of 500 businesses I can buy from, and you're probably going to find what you need. You just didn't know where they were, and so now we do. And so I think that's always going to be a dynamic. We're not going to ask companies to change who they're buying their steel from. That's not going to happen. They're gonna be stuck within the capitalist system, right? Like they're getting what they need for a variety of reasons, and they can shift some of them.
I would just add, what Andrea and Andy said is what I'm, hearing, and that within our, PGE and our own cultural roadmap, integrating an equity lens into that cultural roadmap that has as one of the paths, the supplier diversity, and actually assigning or putting a person from our diversity, equity, and inclusion team, which just grew, by the way, from like one person to now I think there's like 5 people on our DEI team, and one of those leadership focuses is on supplier diversity in our supply chain. So that has definitely happened in the last, that last part about supplier diversity has always been in conversation as we pledged early adopter to Portland Means Progress, but the actual roadmap on how we would get there is really sped up because of COVID, and looking at how are we supporting local businesses, and specifically how are we supporting local BIPOC-owned businesses as we look at the economic recovery that's going to have to happen as we come out of COVID.
Well, Andrea, Andy, Kimberly, thank you so much for your insights. This is just a fascinating model, and I appreciate you taking the time to share it with the group, and it's something that we'll continue to monitor at Brookings. We're excited to see where it goes. With that, I guess I'll turn it back to Chanel.
Yes, thank you so much, Joseph. So on that note, we would like to thank everyone for tuning in this afternoon. As a reminder, the webinar recording and all presentations will be sent to today's attendees. We would like to thank all of our speakers, Joseph, Andy, Andrea, and Kimberly, this afternoon. The information learned in this webinar proves to be very helpful for economic developers who want to ensure that COVID-19 recovery is racially inclusive. As part of the Take Action Against Racism and Economic Development webinar series, our next webinar is titled The Economic Revitalization of the Over-the-Rhine Community, A Balanced Perspective. It will take place on Monday, October 19th from 3 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and the description of it is as follows. The historic Over-the-Rhine, or OTR, neighborhood in Cincinnati, Ohio, experienced an urban economic revitalization after the city exploded in protests and civil unrest in 2001 after the shooting of a 19-year-old unarmed African-American, Timothy Thomas, by a Cincinnati police officer. What did it take to make OTR's economic revitalization successful? This webinar will address this question with the balanced perspective of key players in OTR's revitalization. So please reach out to IEDC with any questions. Be well, stay safe, and have a great afternoon.